Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our eighth installment of Democracy and Vulnerability, hosted by the Wende Museum, Thomas Mann House, and dublab Radio. My name is Zora Nelson, and I'm so excited, along with my fellow student council members, to welcome Professor and author Irfan Nooruddin to the program today. Dr. Irfan Nooruddin is a professor of Indian politics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He studies he studies problems of economic development and globalization, democracy and democratization, and civil conflict around the globe. Among his most important publications are Coalition Politics and Economic Development, Elections in Hard Times, and The Everyday Crusade. He received a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan and a BA in economics and international studies from Ohio Wesleyan University. Today's program will follow a 1 hour discussion with Irfan Nooruddin, moderated by Student Council member Elsa Cooney. Members Matthew Jones, Emma Larson, and I will also pose questions to Irfan Nooruddin. Matthew will write the blog post for the Thomas Mann House website, which will be available for viewing as soon as the interview is posted online. We'd also like to extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for their generous support for the online and on-site discussion series at the Venda. Dr. Nooruddin, it's a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. Now I'd like to pass it to Elsa to begin the discussion.
Right. Well, thank you, Zora, for that wonderful introduction. And again, a big thanks to Dr. Nooruddin for joining us this Wednesday on our panel. Given the current political moment and upcoming elections, I think we've all been looking forward to having this conversation with you and the opportunity to hear your insights on the current state of democracy. We have a lot of ground to cover and unfortunately not a lot of time, so let's get right into it. Zora told us a little bit about your research on democracy-related topics, and Emma is going to start us off with a question that looks more specifically into what your idea of democracy looks like.
Yes, thank you again so much for being here. My question is about well, more generally, but refers to your 2016 book, Elections in Hard Times, which to me seems pretty apt at this moment, considering that there are elections in the US just around the corner, and these times, for a myriad of reasons, feel pretty hard. What I appreciate about some of the synopses and chapters that I've seen of this work of yours is that it insinuates that elections and democracy do not necessarily always go hand in hand, though the general assumption is that they do. The Oxford Dictionary uses the word elections in their definition of democracy. In general knowledge, the two are pretty linked. But if they're not as intimately related as one might initially assume, how do you, in your scholarly work or otherwise, define democracy and real democracy, not just what you call in various of your works, quote, a simple mirage of democracy, or, quote, the democracy promotion industry?
Well, thank you all for this opportunity to be here. I look forward to visiting the Wende Museum in person sometime soon and hopefully meeting all of you. But for today, this opportunity to be on Zoom with you is a great honor, and I'm very, very lucky that you somehow found me on the wonderful internet and invited me to join you. So Emma, thank you for that really deep question. I mean, that could fill an hour in itself, but I'm going to try and be much more concise. Let's take three different sort of tacks at getting at the fundamental question that you've asked, which is what is the relationship between elections and democracy, and how should we think, therefore, about defining democracy more generally? So the first principle, we cannot have democracy if we don't have elections. So in that sense, elections are a necessary condition for democracy. But a key argument made in the 2016 book, which I have right here, for obliged to promote it on behalf of my publisher, right? The key premise in that book is that elections are not sufficient for democracy. So another way to think about it, and to the point too, is that elections occur in most countries on a given day. India's elections take 5 weeks, but it's episodic. In between those elections, we have years. And it is in between those elections that democracy either functions doesn't function, exceeds expectation, or disappoints. And then the third is thinking about the historical context in which the democracy and democratization literature was born. The Wende Museum is dedicated to the study of the Cold War and preserving memory of the Cold War. That is, in fact, when much of the study of democratization begins in academia in the United States. And in that context, right, prior to 1989, if you wanted to distinguish democracies from non-democracies, simply holding an election was a pretty effective way of doing it, right? The countries under the Soviet orbit did not hold elections. Those who were not part of that may or may not have held elections. But in the 1960s or 1970s, a country that held elections, multi-party competitive elections to choose their leader, was almost definitely more democratic than those that did. But you fast forward 20 years from the end of the Cold War, from 1989 to 2009, and lots of countries hold elections. In fact, today, there's only about 7 countries in the world that have never held a national election to choose their leaders. But what that means is that elections on their own are completely inadequate for distinguishing between states in terms of their democracy. And what governments got very good at, what politicians got very good at, was holding elections and using the rules of the state, right, legal rules, to make sure that their opposition did not have much chance of competing, to muzzle the free press, to muzzle civil society. And so elections, qua elections, right, just on their own, increasingly lose what we call, what Tom Flores and I call in our book, the democratizing potential of elections, right? Where once upon a time, the act of holding an election sort of fast-forwarded a country's progress and trajectory into democracy. Today, that's no longer the case. If I told you the next year Putin decides to hold another election in Russia, do you think this is going to be good for Russia's democracy? You're going to say no, because this election is completely cooked, right? It's absolutely fixed. There's no real competition. In fact, if anything, the election, to the extent that it gives them some legitimacy, arguably is bad for democracy as opposed to being good for democracy. So that is that disjuncture that we try and point out in the 2016 book that you so kindly referred to. But let's go back to the first point, which is that without elections, we can't have democracy. Elections, at the end of the day, are the one means by which large societies choose their leaders in peaceful ways, right? It also is the one way in which we can get rid of our leaders in peaceful ways. And so I think your final question, and then I'll seize and move, we can get another one in, though we'll come back to these themes, I'm sure, all through this conversation, is your final question was, how should we really think about what democracy is? And here I'm going to be provocative for the sake of sparking a conversation, right? When I teach my undergrads at Georgetown, I have come to say that the biggest mistake we make when we talk about democracy is we refer to it as majority rule, right? And that is, of course, correct, right? Majority rule, that's how we choose who gets elected. But what really makes a country democratic is how well it protects its minorities, right? How well it protects the most vulnerable among the society. And there we have to think about a whole set of constraints against majority rule. The founders of this country, the United States, were very, very obsessed, very concerned with what they refer to as the tyranny of the majority, right? So we get this elaborate system of checks and balances, 3 co-equal branches of government, executive, legislature, and judiciary, right? We get short terms so that people had to keep going back to the masses to renew the mandate. They were really worried about what happens if a majority basically seizes power. How do you get rid of a party that the majority supports, right? So then we get a permanent minority and a permanent majority, and that's a terrible situation for most societies. And so we got to flip, in a sense, our definition of democracy from thinking just about elections, which is all about the majority's will, and thinking about the daily practice of democracy, which is a lot of checks and balances against the tyranny of the majority and the protection of minority rights writ large. And happy to explore that theme more. So that was a pretty winding answer to a very deep question, Emma, but I hope it gets the conversation going.
Yeah, that was a great start to the conversation. We're definitely going to be exploring, especially about protecting minorities and the role of elections in upholding democracy. Just before we get into some more real life scenarios, and you did cover this briefly, but I was just wondering throughout your research, are there any specific or is there any specific quantitative or qualitative evidence that you use or look for when you're categorizing the strength of a democracy? And are these universal measures, or do they change sort of based on the historical context of that region?
Great question, Elsa. I'm a quantitative researcher, so I do a lot of sort of cross-national analyses. The main data sets that are widely used in political science are really, there's about 4 altogether, all done by academics, some based out of Europe, some based out of the United States. What they share in common is a focus on the political institutions in play. So the most basic of these is how regularly do you hold elections, and are these elections in which the incumbent has even a theoretical chance of losing, right? An election in which there's only one party running is not a meaningful election. An election in which you got more than one party running, you're beginning to talk about maybe one can lose and someone else can win. Others have more institutions that they generate codings for, including who can participate in elections. Again, theoretically, think about a country that has elections, but only 10% of the population is enfranchised, can vote, right? In that sense, maybe the United States at its founding, in which the vast majority of its citizens were not allowed to vote. Is that a democracy? So some would say, I would say no, and some capture that dimension as well. The most famous of which is called the Varieties of Democracy Project. This is a big project based out of Sweden, has a far more expansive idea of what democracy is, including capturing things like freedom of expression, protections of civil society and the ability to organize and form associations, a much more perceptual measure of democracy that's based on expert codings that tell us, hey, experts look at this country, and even though the institutions haven't changed, qualitatively, there's something really fishy going on in the way, minorities are being treated, in the way the press is being attacked, the way judges are being attacked. I use all of these. So the book and the research that we've done uses all of these to show that the results don't depend on one or the other. But if you were going to ask me, in that question, which one do I finally endorse? As attractive as those more multidimensional measures are, I'm a fan of keeping this simple. And I think at the end of the day, we have a lot of elections today in which the incumbent has rigged the rules so completely that there is virtually no chance that they could lose. And so again, come back to Putin and United Russia and those elections over there. The Chinese Communist Party has elections, right? These are not, I'm not taking anything from the election. Maybe they serve some purpose, but these are not democratic elections in the sense of renewing a mandate because the citizens have a choice over there. And so there's this data set put out by a very close friend of mine, Susan Hyde, who's a professor at UC Berkeley. And the definition they use is which elections can be lost. And if you could not imagine that the election could be lost, you're not a democracy. If you could imagine the election could be lost, it can be. Just on the US election, I mean, one of the statistics I like to point out to my, to my friends and students is that about 85% of US congressional races are not competitive. They're entirely decided at the primary level, right? If in a lot of districts in California, I mean, right, in Los Angeles, if a Democrat wins the primary, they're going to win the congressional seat. If you go further inland in California, that switches. Maybe if you're a Republican and you win that primary, you're going to win the seat. That's 80+% of all congressional seats in the United States are not competitive when you get to the general election. That's the result of years of gerrymandering, of drawing borders to make sure that these are safe seats, etc. But there is something, I would argue, that begins to corrode the quality of the democracy when these politicians don't actually have to worry about real competition from across the aisle. They're worried about within the party, and that just forces, on both sides, arguably, I'm not going to make false equivalences here. I think the Republican Party has gone much more in this direction, where you get very extreme candidates competing for the right to run for that seat. And because they know they don't have to worry about an opposition from the other side. That's at the congressional level. Fortunately, our Senate races tend to be more competitive. The national election tends to be very competitive. But in lots of countries, all the elections have that feature of once you get the ticket, you're going to win the seat. And that, I think, is problematic.
Can I jump in and ask a very quick question
Yeah,
that could bring us to a lot? So you can answer very quickly. What do you think about ranked voting systems?
big fan.
Okay.
Right? Big fan. So you look at what has been done in the Pacific Northwest, that there's been a lot more innovation in this. We look at even Alaska's version of this. What we have, the problem right now with a lot of our electoral system in the US, and India uses a similar one, right? It's what we call a first past the post system. Who wins? You get one vote, each district has one representative. Is that becomes a very crude way of expressing preferences, and people have very multidimensional preferences. Most countries in the world have much more sophisticated and nuanced electoral systems than that. In Europe, we have complicated, but they're not that complicated, but much more complex and nuanced proportional representation systems that ensure that groups enter. You have party list systems that have done incredible, had incredible effects of raising the representation of women in particular in parliament, right? Because some countries insist that a certain number of people on the party list, including at the high end of the party list, have to be women. In other words, we have a lot of tools, and ranked choice voting is one example of that, where we could make our elections just as robust and just as competitive, but by giving citizens more options of how to express their rank ordering and their preferences within the system. So, but the reason we don't get that change is, of course, it benefits particular parties and particular incumbents. It benefits the status quo. And, truthfully, Emma, we're so far from ranked choice. We're talking about a country right now where the biggest fights are whether or not people can be registered to vote. America makes it harder to register to vote than any advanced industrial country in the world, right? And we have election systems in Georgia. They've allowed a system in which any citizen can challenge the registration status of any other citizen, right? I mean, this is scary, right? It's going to tie up the Georgia election. I mean, we thought 2020 was complicated in terms of the lawsuits and all of that. 2024 is going to be just as ugly, if not uglier, because they've now had 4 years to sort of try and put people in positions that can stop this. So there's a broader question over here. The title of the series is Democracy and Vulnerability. And I think one of the things I would ask us to think about is that the vulnerability of democracy is now from within the system. If we were having this conversation 30 years ago, we'd be worried about the military in Latin America. Are they going to send the tanks in? We'd be worried about a coup d'etat, right? Coup d'etats are vanishingly rare any longer. Military dictatorships are vanishingly rare any longer. But now the bureaucrats and the rule of law is undermined in a way that the democracy gets undermined from within. And I think that is different. So again, institutions matter, the rules of the system matter. And I think we should be asking really hard questions about why is it that in a country that takes the vote as to be sacred, right? America's identity is based on the idea of it as being the oldest democracy. Do we make elections so difficult for everyday citizens to be able to express complex preferences in?
That's super fascinating. And I want to pick up on kind of what you talked about with the Georgia kind of citizen policing policies, where that can really just completely undermine the whole process of people, voting and having that enfranchisement. And in one of your books, you talked about how one of the most persistent threats to democracy is specifically this idea that some citizens might not actually be all that interested in defending democracy, in the small d democracy, and are happy to kind of give the country over to authoritarian figures so long as the authoritarian figure is able to punish the right people, or express the grievances of those citizens, right? Where democracy itself is not the end goal of their vision for the American system. And so I was just curious, like, because we don't want to obviously turn just regular citizens into enemies of the state, right? Threats to democracy and label them as such. But then at the same time, I think it is helpful to understand that that attitude and that behavioral pattern is threatening to democracy. So what are some of your insights into how democracies might identify or address that kind of sticky situation?
Yeah, so really nice question. I've thought a lot, been thinking a lot about this in the context of India, the country I was born and raised in, thinking obviously the US, the country that I've made my home, right? In both of which you have elections occurring on a regular basis in which at least one of the major parties, in India's case, the ruling party, in the US case right now, the opposition, I mean, Donald Trump and his version of the Republican Party, arguably actively anti-democratic and in that small d democratic sense. And the question of why do so many citizens who seem perfectly decent individuals probably in their daily life willing to tolerate this? So I've got this analogy in my head that I'll try out on you and you can tell me whether it works or not, right? The way in which it's often been thought of is think about, the myth about the frog in a pot of water and you start boiling it real slow and the frog doesn't realize that the water is getting warmer, but it's not boiling and doesn't, by the time it realizes it's too late. That analogy makes us think about the whole society is slowly being undermined, and we don't see the individual small degradations of democracy as problematic until it's really spilled over. That's one analogy. Here's my other. Think about a cake, right? A big old cake. And we don't cut the cake, we don't slice the cake across the top all the way to the bottom. We cut the cake by slicing into the middle and we take out a sliver, or in my case, a big chunk, right? Out, kind of. If you think of that analogy, right? What's happening? The rest of the cake is intact, but this slice has come out. So think about democracy in that way. These citizens don't think of themselves as supporting an authoritarian, right? They're voting in elections. In fact, in many cases, they think that they are representing majority sentiment, right? The question about that small d democracy is how do we get these citizens and how do we think about a world in which what I want for my government to do might not be doable, not because what I want is unjust or whatever, but because there are limits to what the government can do because we worry about other groups that will be negatively harmed, right? So what is the obligation of the majority to the minority of the country? How do we want to think about those rights? And so that, Matt, is for me, I think what we got to think about is that this is not about changing hearts and minds, but actually thinking about how do we build rules and institutions that make it very, very hard for a majoritarian government to come into power and completely abuse the institutions of power, right? The federal government in the United States and the executive branch has incredible amounts of power, right? And so what happens is if we get a federal government, if run by the wrong person, who can cause tremendous harm to the environment, to particular individuals, to foreign policy, all of that kind of stuff, right? In a perfect world, we have a judiciary that serves as a check and balance. How do we think about what is the ways in which we strengthen that judicial system, but also how do we use pretty boring probably for a group of artists like yourselves or historians like yourself, but how do we get the best minds, legal minds to say, here's how we shore up the legal frameworks of some of these things so that somebody can't just write an executive order on day one and get this out. I'm an institutionalist, so maybe that's what I'll just say to conclude this, is that I don't want to demonize individual citizens. I think if you ask citizens, they're going to tell you, and we've done a lot of interviews from the most recent book on Christian nationalism in the United States. These are individuals who do think that they care deeply about their country. They want America to succeed, and all of that. But the way they draw the lines about what it means to be an American, who's in, who's out, right, are very stark. And so when they go to the polls, they're looking for someone who will fulfill that agenda. If that agenda is not fulfillable through an elected politician, maybe they vote on some other dimension. But as long as they think that by getting a particular politician in, they can, fight the woke agenda, fight whatever agenda they want, why should we be surprised that that's how they choose to go? So the other vulnerability that I think we have to take much more seriously is the vulnerability of the social norms that democracy relied upon, right? I think for a lot of us who've been observing American politics and politics more generally, the utter shamelessness of the political class is staggering, right? I mean, and so I've begun to think about, can democracy sustain itself in a world in which shame, and I realize that's a very old-fashioned kind of sentiment, but in which shame doesn't exist, right? That people are willing to go out on national television and tell outright lies, right? Where misinformation and disinformation gets pumped through the system, where misogynist and racist statements get made about opposition candidates, about citizens, where you have a president, ex-president, referring to his opponent as a nasty woman and stupid and all sorts of other things. I think we've, it's not like politics once upon a time was all Pollyannish and polite and all of that. It's always been that. But when that has no penalty attached to it, then I think the wheels have a chance of coming off the wagon completely. So one of the other things I think we need to be thinking about is, what is the role of the artist? What are the role of sort of storytellers, of journalists, to basically reintroduce a certain sense of, there are certain lines that if you cross, there's a social penalty to it. What does that look like in the system? Because without that, I think we end up demonizing each other without any end to it, right? I mean, it just becomes, we can say anything we want on social media about lots of other people. There's no penalty. We can construct echo chambers and bubbles, and that lack of a public space that is actually policed by the public, right? Of saying you can't say that, that is beyond the pale. I think, again, very old-fashioned. Don't ask me how we get that operationalized, other than thinking about everyday citizens' responsibility to sort of enforce basic norms of decorum and propriety with each other and for ourselves. But I think without that, we've got some pretty scary times ahead for democracy more generally.
For sure. I mean, I think a lot of the anxiety many of us feel is in that sort of sense of the disintegrating potential of us to be able to regulate, and to share kind of similar languages. And just as a side note, I do enjoy thinking about cakes more than boiling frogs. So I think your analogy there is a smash hit, personally.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt, so much for that question. And I think especially when focusing on or discussing the impact of the individual versus the institution is particularly relevant to our theme of democracy and vulnerability, because nobody, as an individual, as a citizen of a country that you are a part of and that you love and you want the best for, wants to think that they are contributing to the fall of democracy. And Professor, you said something about who's in and who's not, and that kind of got me thinking about how national identity seems to be increasingly defined in opposition to the other, and kind of invokes this question of who belongs and who doesn't. And it seems it's almost impossible, it seems, to discuss the construction of national identity, especially historically, without mentioning the role that race plays in identity and politics, which brings me to Zora's question about the changing narratives of national identity within the context of race.
Thank you, Elsa. Yes, I want to say, after reading Proud to be an American, The Changing Relationship of National Pride and Identity, I wanted to know, what do you think is the role of race in discussing 9/11 specifically? It's very apparent that America is an extremely racialized country, one that's especially Black and white. And I wonder if a reason why so many white Americans in particular feel disturbed by this tragedy is possibly because it was a rare occurrence in which they felt threatened due to their identity. And with this, I was wondering, is there a direct correlation between tragedy and nationalism? And an example that came to mind was the creation of the Black Panther Party after facing injustice in their communities due to police brutality, and how that led to this ideology of Black nationalism. And further, I wanted to know if you think the potential election of a Black American and Southeast Asian woman will alter any perceptions of what it means to be an American.
There's a couple of PhD theses in those questions, Zora's, but look, I think 9/11 was a traumatic event for anyone who lived through it, right? But you're right that, and what we show in Proud to be an American in that paper is that there's traditionally been a distinction between what we call patriotism and what we call nationalism. And the notion is that one can love one's country without othering and demonizing other countries, call that patriotism, and that nationalism has a much more ethnocentric bias to it. So to be a nationalist is to think that your country is superior to other countries, and to be a patriot is to be that I love my country, but other people in other countries are perfectly legitimate as well. And what we show in that paper using the General Social Survey, which is a global national survey, is that in the United States, between 1996 and 2004, one before 9/11, after 9/11, that the gap between patriotism and nationalism basically vanishes in 2004. That even those people who think of themselves as patriots actually espouse a lot of nationalist sentiment as well. And that this is basically from psychology, we use something called terror management theory, that faced with the existential threat of 9/11, people basically double down on their core identities and really demonize anyone who they see as a threat to that identity. Race is fundamental to America's understanding of itself, right? And so I'm sure you've read Nicole Hannah-Jones' the idea of America, but if anyone hasn't, I highly recommend it. This is, of course, the curator of the 1619 Project, right? But the point made by her and by so many others is that to understand the founding of America and American identity without talking about race is is a travesty, right? I mean, that race is fundamentally locked into what it means to be an American, and that, some have referred to race as slavery as America's original sin, right? That it both corrodes and infects all parts of American identity going forward. But in a way that I think 9/11 sort of exposed, because what it meant was it forced the question of what does it mean to be an American, right? In a way, I've been in America since 1992, which is when I came to the States for college, right? 2001 and the years after that, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, were the most visceral that I remembered of people basically demanding an answer to how can you oppose the war? That means you don't love America, etc. It felt much more fractured. And over there, you got to now introduce, of course, that into all of that comes Barack Obama, right? A person who, both by virtue of his funny name, as he called it, right, as he referred to it, the Hussein in the middle of his name, the birtherism attacks against him, claiming that he wasn't actually American, the claims that he was a secret Muslim, exposing all the deepest racist fears of a large section of American society that, of course, we know the ending of that story, which is Obama overcame that, was able to sort of build a coalition that kept him in office. But the backlash to that, of course, one might argue, was Donald Trump in 2016. So, Zora, I think the core of race as a formation and a fundamental part of American identity is really, really critical. You can't think of it without it. And we do know from a lot of research, not my research, but from other people's research, that terror attacks, attacks on the homeland are highly correlated with a rise and spike in nationalism and in xenophobic actions, right? Attacks against visible minorities in your society. In France, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks on the banning of wearing the hijab and head coverings in France under the principle of laissez-faire kind of idea. But again, in reaction and in response to the perceived sort of Islamist threat within France, we see this all over the world. In India, the worst riots in Indian history, recent Indian history, sort of in 2002, occurred right after an attack on Hindu pilgrims that killed about 20 people, slightly more than 20 people, over 50 people, led to riots against Muslims, a pogrom against Muslims that killed 3,000 in the span of a week. So we get this unfortunate reaction all the time. I do think that the Black Panther Party and the formation of Black nationalism is distinct. I do think you're right that the assassinations and the violence, police violence against civil rights movements and the protests against Vietnam spurs that consciousness. But Black nationalism as a philosophical creed and as an ideology precedes the 1960s, right? Goes back to Du Bois, goes back arguably, right, even deeper than that. So the notion that, whether or not African Americans, as they thought about their role as in part of this broader American project, right, those questions I think have long been explored and hopefully will continue to be explored, right? I mean, they're deep and fundamental and completely legitimate questions that I think exist independent of the particular political moment of the Black Panther Party. So that fast forwards then, of course, to Vice President Harris and what the implications of her possibly becoming the next president are for this broader thing of identity. And I think the short answer there is that it's going to be bifurcated, right? The fact of the matter is you look at polls and the optimist in me says that for a generation of young girls, right, of all colors, right, and all creeds, they'll see a woman president, and that'll be inspirational and transformative for them as in terms of representation. For a lot of young people of color, right, it'll show them that a glass ceiling has been broken once again in that regard. But for a lot of white people in the United States, it will be a doubling down of that this is a country that we are losing, right, that this is no longer our country. And to think that this won't have that reaction, I think would be naive. To think that misogyny, right, won't play a role, including within the African-American community, right, and including among communities of color, would be wrong. I mean, the core support right now, the biggest gap, right, in American politics is the Black-white voting gap, and the second biggest gap is the male-female voting gap, right? So we have two parties now that are really drawing their support from very different coalitions of American voters, but white people as a whole, and I apologize for the crudity of, such a broad characterization, but those who self-identify as white on surveys, men and women, the majority of them say that they will vote for President Trump in the next election. For white men, that percentage goes up to about 70%, right? 70-75%. These are our friends, our classmates, right? Our co-workers, right? For white women, that's about 54-55%. And it's possible that Roe v. Wade and the attack on women's reproductive rights and women's healthcare in the United States will change that a little bit and maybe get some white suburban women to shift their vote, but maybe not. So look, the optimist in me wants to say that with every time we crack the glass ceiling, right, Barack Obama once, there's a whole generation that for whom this becomes more normal, right? Your generation is a generation that has grew up with a Black president, right? That's a very powerful thing. If we have another Black woman as president, there'll be a whole generation of people for whom large parts of their young life, this becomes normal. They learn to understand it. But the notion that there isn't also a backlash, I think, would be naive. And I think we'd want to think very hard. And so the framing of the DNC, I think, was quite artful in this regard, right? Vice President Harris, in accepting the nomination, didn't mention a race, didn't mention a gender. It's a focus on freedom, a fundamental American value. It's a focus on joy, focus on bringing people together, the choice of Governor Walz. I don't know whether all of that's going to work or not, but I think if she does get elected, that would be maybe an investment in moving forward in a way that might be somewhat constructive, right? Because what she's not doing, they're picking on Donald Trump big time and on J.D. Vance big time, but they're, I think, trying very hard not to make it sound like it's us versus them in terms of the societal difference. There's a real emphasis on Americans are one, we are all the same, right? Those Midwestern values kind of stuff, while essentially trying to characterize Trump and Vance as out of touch, not just with America, but also with the broader Republican Party. And so, that's a very complex answer to a very good question, but I think that change could be both transformative for young generation, but again, with a backlash that we need to be thinking upfront about how do we counter that, right? How do we saw, you were probably too young to see it, but I very much saw firsthand the overt racism that was leveled against the Obamas when they were in the White House by politicians and all of that. And to expect that won't be doubled down on with a Black woman in the White House, I think would be naive. So we got to protect her if she gets there. We got to protect the society more generally. But let's see, we have a long way to go between now and November 5th.
On a part of that backlash, I'm wondering, so, I grew up in more conservative evangelical spaces, and I still keep an eye out on, so for instance, one of the most profound religious influences in my life at the time is now sort of taking control of a city in Eastern Washington and forming militias and stuff like that. And the language they use, of course, is very, you're talking about sort of the backlash and the polarization, and it's exceeding political language. It's becoming language of demonic influence or of, the spiritual dissolution of America. And increasingly, there's been a lot of studies done on kind of how evangelicalism is shifting or how fundamentalism is shifting in contemporary American politics. But we are seeing maybe this rise in, people call it Christian nationalism, but that can mean so many different things, right? But just in general, the sense of Americans whose sense of politics is increasingly maybe shaped by these ultimate claims that religion makes on them and these visions of their political enemies becoming spiritual enemies. And thus now political problems or political disagreements have become elevated into questions of ultimate moral significance or of good versus evil, God versus Satan. And so I was wondering, with your most recent book, The Everyday Crusade, as you studied, these notions of Christian exceptionalism or religious exceptionalism and just on, daily lives of these kinds of people, what are some trends you saw or mechanisms you saw that might help these people maybe become more accepting of, allowing for that governmental oversight so that their ideas about how to address these questions remains political rather than, religious zeal or violence or something that exceeds political boundaries, if that makes sense?
Yeah. No, so I wish I had an answer to that question, but I do think it's the biggest challenge we have. The problem with allowing religion, there's a reason the founders, I think, had separation of church and state so explicitly in there, because I think they understood that once religion enters the chat, if you would, right, the stakes go too high, right? If the cost of me disagreeing with you on a policy issue is that I am now an unbeliever, sort of a right, or actually against your God, then
and I get it because I've been there, right? I've believed.
right. No, I hear you.
Yeah,
I hear you. It's like we did a lot of, my colleagues did, Ali Shortle at the University of Oklahoma and Eric McDaniel at the University of Texas. Eric's first book was basically a study of politics in Black churches, and Ali's works at Oklahoma is a lot of field work with evangelical populations. I mean, again, these are people who are very well-meaning in a very deep sense about sort of themselves. They take their own ethics very seriously. But because the political sphere has become where we have the fights about, how we decide among these sorts of issues, including sort of the role of God in our lives, then the stakes become unbearably high. To oppose this is to be against your God, and no genuine believer is going to be happy with that, right? I mean, so this is the line that we use in a recent review, a response to a recent review by Jason Bivens of the book, right? And Bivens, in his book that we were responding to, has this powerful argument that the real danger of democracy of religion is that it undermines the self-regulation required of functioning modern democracy. And what he means by that, and what I really liked about that argument, is that in a functioning democracy, we impose on ourselves limits about what we want the political sphere to deliver for us, right? we basically say we would want government to be interfering in private lives of people. We don't want government telling us which God we can pray to, telling us what kind of healthcare we can access, to not telling us all this sort of stuff. We want government to do the things that are public good facing, etc. If those are the lines that we impose on ourselves, there are certain issues that are still close and deeply part of our hearts, right? I mean, we might care very deeply about, a whole bunch of other things, but we don't allow those to enter the political sphere because that's not what politics is supposed to be dealing with. And so even in the evangelical church, and you know this better than I, Matthew, there's a debate about the degree to which the church should stay out of politics because it is supposed to be above politics, where they're dealing with a much deeper set of questions than everyday who wins an election. But of course, for lots of others, you wade into that politics and then you get the kind of political system we're currently. And I think one of the questions is sort of, is there, and I'll ask you this, is there room and is there a move for some of that self-regulation happening from within evangelical spaces, right? Of people saying, I was raised in this tradition, I'm as Christian as anybody, but this notion that what it means to be a good Christian is to show fealty to a particular political party, to a particular political leader, just because we think he will give us some policy win down the line, right? That's problematic. I don't want that to occur. I want this to be kept separate. If we can't get that self-regulation from within the movement, then I think we get that polarization getting deeper and deeper. But if at some point good religiously observant individuals of all kinds tell their religious leaders, hang on, you can't keep saying that, right? To be part of your church doesn't mean I have to be voting for this particular person. And then I think we might get some of that self-regulation in the civic space. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate over what it means to love your neighbor, I think is kind of where a lot of the crux is happening. And the content of the word love can either mean doing everything necessary in order to encourage someone to have a closer relationship with God, which can mean either, giving them agency and space and, not impinging on it, or it can mean, enforcing morality so that they do not become further from God than they might otherwise be, right? And so I think that within evangelicalism, there's obviously quite a range in the content of the meaning of the word love, but I've seen kind of that's where a lot of the debate is happening, and it's becoming more polarized in that sense over specifically issues of abortion. And as Kamala is Vice President Harris is depicted as kind of increasingly extreme, that notion of it would be unloving, the guardrails would come off of the nation and people would be too far gone. Like, so there's kind of this more catastrophic language that's creeping into it. And so the most loving thing is to prevent this at all costs.
Yeah.
And then if not, then to sort of do this kind of militaristic secession in a sense and just batten down the hatches, turn your towns into small sort of church state communities.
Yep.
And that's and then it becomes easy because you're only focusing on your neighbors. And so that's kind of the other dimension too, has been again a debate over local or religion as a national phenomenon and needing national sort of enforcement, or religion as like a local phenomenon that it can be enforced through interpersonal relationships. So there, I mean, a lot of my friends are still wonderful people who are, of course, against those forms of violence. But there's a lot of, I see the word love constantly is what is debated, because we all talk about loving our neighbor as essential to, evangelicalism or Christianity. But now there's that fight over, but can you really love someone if you're allowing the government to become hostile to Christianity?
And I think sincere debate about that could be very profound, right? I mean, and a cynical weaponization of that same sentiment can be truly dangerous, because what can be a more powerful emotion and motivator than love of neighbor and love of God? I mean, and so it's a very, very so I think that's what makes me worried about it. It's not that I don't think people should bring religion into the public sphere. How could they not, right? But how do we think about sort of where the democracy, again, just to come back to a theme I've tried to make over the course of this conversation, I think I've come to appreciate through my research and through just observing the world, how much of what makes democracy work is actually self-imposed self-regulation, about basically saying losers of elections having the good grace to say, I lost the election, right? Best of luck, and I will run again next time. We'll have honest disagreements. Opposition parties sitting in opposition as a responsible opposition, asking hard questions of the incumbent, holding them to task, but not, as they did to Obama at the State of the Union, shouting, you lie, right from the floor of Congress. So what a violation of basic norms of human decency, but also professional conduct, right? Those are self-regulatory, because the moment we stop doing those things, it's not like there's actually any penalty, right? Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene can say the most horrendous things about Kamala Harris, about Joe Biden, etc., but they are running for election out of a very safe seat. They know that they just have to be slightly more extreme than the next guy in the primary, and they're going to win the election. That's a system that there's no incentive for self-regulation. So if you look at there's something called the nominate scores. This is an analysis of roll call voting, right, in the U.S. Congress and Senate. And the U.S. has great records, so we can go all the way back to the first Congress and see how people voted. The polarization of our representatives in terms of how they vote has gone like this. The graph looks like this, right? But what's interesting is that the Democrats are more or less on a flat line, and the Republicans have gone like that, right? Much more extreme. So just over the weekend, the House Majority Leader said that any piece of legislation sponsored by a Democrat is dead on arrival, right? I mean, this is your job, right? You don't have to sponsor it, you don't have to like it, but the notion that off the bat you're going to say that anything that comes from the opposition is dead on arrival in a legislative chamber, right? And he did that in a fundraiser, right? He did that because he knows that this is what people will actually reward as opposed to punish. So I worry that a little bit of this might sound like I'm just trying to beat up on one side or whatever it is, but I think it's fair to call a spade. And I do think it's an example of not necessarily a society that's gone off the rails, but what happens when within a party, using the rules of the game, using the institutions of the system, right, what can happen without us realizing it. None of us saw this as a likely conclusion of a party that once had John McCain and others sort of as its standard bearers. How did we get here? So I think we have hard questions to ask in that regard in terms of how do we rebuild from within this. If Kamala Harris is elected, what I would love for her to do is almost invite Republicans to reclaim their party so that we can have a serious opposition party in this country. Democracy works best when there's a real opposition party. And I think, America will be healthier if there's both a strong Democratic and a Republican party that are genuinely trying to solve policy issues, find common ground where that's possible. Because a lot of the issues that we didn't get a chance to talk about today, things like climate change, right, in particular climate change, those are existential questions, and we don't even have a conversation about them because there's no space in our politics for that. And I think there's, at some point we're going to pay the piper on that stuff, and it won't be pleasant.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you also, Matt, for bringing your personal insights onto the question of religion. I know I personally can't speak on the moral quandaries of the evangelical church or anything like that, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, we have 3 minutes. I know we wanted to sort of discuss democracy on a more global scale, as well as sort of the electoral institutions that uphold our democracy and the efficacy of those. I unfortunately don't think we're going to get to those. So I think I'm just going to end it with a question from Zora, and we can sort of conclude this discussion on a forward-looking note. If you wanted to just ask about sort of a vision for the future.
Thank you. And thank you for such a robust discussion, even with, you know, so little of our questions. I think we touched on a lot of important topics, and I'm honored to close it out by asking, what are your hopes for the trajectory of democracy on a global scale?
Thank you, firstly, to all of you for such a great conversation. I apologize for maybe going on too long with some of those answers, but Zora, I really hope, I believe in democracy, and I think it's critical that we sort of be pretty unstinting and unapologetic in our defense of democracy globally. I think as Americans in particular, there is often a quandary, because I think even, you know, young Americans and old Americans more generally who believe in democracy also suffer a bit of a crisis of confidence. How do we go and tell other countries to be democracies when we know all the limitations of our own democracy, right? We understand the hypocrisy of that, we understand all of that, and yet democracy needs champions, right? It needs people to go out and make the case for it. And so America's defense of democracy, I've written about it, right, in my recent contribution to something in International Studies Review, where I actually refer to it as sort of as theater, right, democracy promotion theater. But at the end of the day, without champions for democracy, those who are disenfranchised around the world deal with governments that are incredibly repressive, that are incredibly willing to use violence against their own citizens. And so we have to think about what the international commitment to this is. And in that regard, I do think, and this is not the most PC thing to say, I'm going to sound kind of conservative, but I do think that a successful American democracy does serve as a beacon and as an inspiration to lots of people around the world. In the same way that I do think that, you know, the relative success of the opposition party in India's last election was a real shot in the arm. I think the fact that Lula won in Brazil was really reassuring. I think the fact that Macron was able to somehow keep, you know, the French far right, and Macron's got a lot of problems, but he kept the French far right out of France at a time that we thought that that was going to be kind of problematic. I think we've seen within Europe a lot of right-wing parties come, but we've also seen in England the Tories get kicked out and Labour get a tremendous majority. So democracy does renew itself. It does sort of have victories, and I would hope that, you know, with those we accept the responsibility that we got to improve democracy at home, but we also have, I think, a moral obligation to argue in favor of democracy objectively and unstintingly globally. So my hope for the future is that we don't feel bad about saying democracy is the best of all the systems, even if it's got all its problems, right? And we don't try and draw false equivalencies between, you know, a badly functioning democracy and an autocracy. I live in badly functioning democracies. I would much rather have that than any autocracy I can think of. And so, but with all of you working towards those goals, I think the future is bright. So best of luck to all of us.
Well, thank you so much. I think we were able to fit a lot into just an hour, and we're also grateful you were able to join us today on this Wednesday. This episode is going to be up on Dublab tomorrow, as well as posted on our YouTube channel, if you guys want to recommend to friends or family. And once again, Dr. Nooruddin, this has been a great conversation. I think I'm not sure if it's made people feel better or worse about the excuse me. She has a lot to say on this topic. I'm not sure if this makes anybody feel better or worse, about the upcoming elections, but she's really stressed out about the state of democracy. I'm sorry. But I think we all had learned a lot from today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.